Welcome back to Behavioral Science for Brands, a podcast where we bridge the gaps between academics and practical marketing. Every week, we sit down and go deep behind the science that powers some of today's most successful marketing. I'm Michael Aaron Flicker.
And I'm Richard Shotton.
And today, episode 101, we're dedicating to Richard and my's biggest project together yet, our new book, Hacking the Human Mind. Let's get into it. So, Richard, we had this vision many episodes ago, long before even episode 50, I bet, 2.5 years ago. What if we took the success of what we were seeing on the podcast and we committed to doing a bigger, deeper partnership together? What if we wrote a book? And now it feels good. I have for everyone listening at home, I have a book on my plate here. We have the book. It's really here, and it just feels so good to have it in hand and to have it in market. It launched September 30th, 2025, so it's been in market a few months. Let's start at the beginning. Why was this important in your mind to take what we were doing on the podcast, advance it, and put it in a book?
Yeah, I think it's really important because thinking back to experience of being in an agency, working as a marketer, and that fundamental question of how do we know what to do next with our brand? And what most people do, what most marketers do, if they're looking for inspiration, they turn to successful brands. They think, what has Apple or Tesla or Amazon, what have they done that I could learn from? And I think that's probably the most common source of inspiration in the industry. And it sounds really, really sensible. But there's a fundamental flaw, which is even a phenomenally successful brand like Apple, they do lots and lots of things. They do thousands of different actions and strategies and tactics, some of which work, probably the majority work, but there's quite a few duds in there as well. And if you just randomly copy the things that they do, you might be picking something that has limited impact. Because of course, a business is not a science experiment. A business is interested in growth, not providing learnings for other people. So they'll do hundreds of things concurrently. It's very hard for the observer to work out what's effective. So what we did with the book was think, well, how can we move on from that situation? We still look at lots of super successful brands, but we started by looking at all the different tactics they had, but then we do the next crucial step. Then we overlay those behaviors with a behavioral science angle. So a filter, we looked at which of the tactics the brands had used, which of the strategies they'd used were also proven in experimental peer review conditions. And that makes it much easier for people to copy successfully. We've identified like the secret ingredients, the magic formula that these brands are using that can be used in many other different situations. It's that overlay of behavioral science principles and amazingly successful brands.
And I think something that you and I agreed early on in the project of the book was we don't need to validate that the folks making the marketing at the time actually knew the behavioral science they were taking advantage of. In fact, it doesn't matter if they knew the Keats heuristic or the Pratfall effect. What's important is that we can identify that the work took advantage of a human insight that we can then back up with the study. Because if you could see the work in market taking advantage of that psychological insight, and then you can understand the peer-reviewed academic study behind it, it gives you that confidence that you can then use that creative application for your own needs and in your own business settings.
Yeah, there's a really famous example from DDB, Bill Bernbach, whose agency in 1959, they ran the VW ad, Ugly is Only Skin Deep. 1962, the agency did Avis, we're number 2, so we try harder. You know, they were regular users of what is known as the pratfall effect. They would admit a flaw in the product to make themselves more appealing. Now, that definitely wasn't inspired by the academic work. The academic work wasn't done till 1966. It was done 7 years later by Elliot Aronson. But what Bill Bernbach and his team knew was instinctively the power of admitting a flaw. Bernbach said a small admission gains a large acceptance. So absolutely, there is a route for entrepreneurs, for brilliant creative directors, through very careful attention to what other people are doing, to understand these psychological principles without knowing the name. The value, though, of the research is it weeds out which of these insights from brilliant entrepreneurs and brilliant creative directors, which ones are genuine and replicable, and which ones were unfortunately on their kind of bad days and weren't actually helping towards the success.
And a build on that, it's one thing to see, like in our example of Apple and their use of concreteness. We can go, maybe we'll add that to our conversation today. It's one thing to hear how Steve Jobs took advantage of it, but it's another thing to understand the underlying insight that the study reveals, because it teaches you more about concreteness and concrete phrasing and abstract phrasing in a wider sense. You've got a great example in what Steve Jobs did on stage with Apple, but more importantly, the academics teach you about the human insight, the human behavior that you might take advantage of in a slightly different way when you apply it to your brands. So to us, it was a pairing. You had to have the brand example. It's easy to remember. It helps you recall the principles in a very practical way. But you also have to have the academic study, because it gives you the breadth of the knowledge. It gives you the deeper understanding.
Yeah, and that deep understanding has a practical purpose. It makes it easier to harness the same insight, harness the bit of the idea that has the power, not the superfluous bits around the creative idea.
And then we end each chapter with 3 key takeaways that you can use in your business or your brand today. So we really tried to make sure that every chapter was actionable. And that to us really made sure that we weren't stuck in academia only. We weren't stuck in brand examples only, but we were really focused on how can this be useful for people?
Yeah, that's absolutely crucial. I think it's a real waste of an amazing opportunity if people just read about experiments but don't apply them. The purpose of the book is to be a very practical manual. Anyone who's interested in persuading other people, anyone who's interested in selling more, anyone who's interested in more effective marketing, there's so much in there that they can use.
Yeah, and one other thought that I was having was, different folks learn differently. And for many listening to our podcast, they're listening while they're driving to work, they're listening at the gym, and it's a passive experience to pick up the nuggets of good ideas to help widen your worldview, change your perspective. But a written book is almost more like a practical field guide. You can come back to it. You can put post-it notes in certain pages. You can underline and underscore, and it can become more of a resource that you use throughout your career, that you use throughout your days at work. And for us, having that more physical manifestation of our ideas, we felt would be very helpful to people. And I think a very lovely unexpected thing that I learned after we published was it was not just brand managers and CMOs that were giving us praise and good feedback. CEOs, CFOs said, "Oh, I now see what the marketing department is coming to me with in different ways." And lots of small business people, companies with a few employees that are looking to get an edge in the market. We've heard from both, if you consider that a spectrum, both ends of the spectrum, lots of different users have gotten value out of the book.
Yeah, behavioural science is the study of how to effectively influence people, how to effectively change their behaviour. Now, a marketeer can use that to change the copy that they use, the in-store ads, the TV ads they create. But someone in HR can use it to persuade a colleague to adopt a new behaviour that the company wants to be happening more regularly. So if you're in any job that is trying to influence people, there's a role for behavioural science.
Have we made the case of why we were so excited about it? I think we've made the argument of why it was so exciting to us to write it. shall we get into maybe some of the insights from the book?
I think that's a good idea. So how about let's start. What is your favourite chapter? I know in many ways that's like asking people to pick between their children, but if you were forced on pain of death, what would you put down as your favourite chapter?
When put that way, I revert to my childhood, and a comfort food of so many American children is Kraft macaroni and cheese. Like walking down the aisle, you see that blue box, and I think for our American listeners, they know even where it is in the grocery store. It's such a central part of growing up in America, is eating some type of macaroni and cheese at some point in your childhood. And so, it was really a twofold pleasure for me to write our chapter on Kraft macaroni and cheese. One, because I got to study and learn about the history of the brand, which is how we start each chapter, usually very small, just a page, 2, 3, 4 pages of the history of the brand to set up what we're going to talk about. But that grounding is always so interesting to me. So I love stories of brands' histories. We do it in every chapter. I love doing it in Kraft macaroni and cheese. And then the second part was they had just a fantastic application of behavioral science when they made a recipe change for the brand. So let's give the backstory here. So Kraft macaroni and cheese was not always that famous blue box in the grocery store aisle. In fact, it was originally started by a pretty ingenuitive salesman who took dried pasta, dried cheese, rubber bands them together, and selling them door to door. Kraft sees the success of this and develops the idea into a consumer packaged good. And in 1937, just before the outbreak of World War II, the brand is first sold as boxed macaroni and cheese, and it's an immediate hit. And it's an immediate hit for some really interesting historical reasons. First, it's during the war, and one coupon gets you 2 boxes of Kraft macaroni and cheese. So right away, it's a real deal. You can feed your family using 2 boxes of macaroni and cheese. But 2, think about the country in the late 30s, early 40s. Men were off at war, and women were much more likely to be in factories, away from the home. So convenience foods of all types were taking off. And macaroni and cheese also did not require a refrigerator to store it. So really a perfect product for that time. The first year of the launch alone, 9 million boxes are sold, and its popularity has not dipped. Today, Kraft reportedly sells 1 million boxes a day, 365 million boxes a year. It's a lot of macaroni and cheese. So just love that brand story. I love that history. So our interest in how they took advantage of behavioral science picks up in 2016. And if you can think about 10 years ago, the world was starting to be more aware of healthy food choices, what was going into the food that they were eating. And Kraft makes a decision that they're going to trade out artificial ingredients like preservatives, flavorings, and coloring. And they're going to, instead of like a yellow dye, they're going to bring in paprika, turmeric. They're going to use natural colors and flavors. But they have this insight that what if this ingredient change could hurt sales in the long run? So they make a marketing decision. For almost 2 months, 50 million boxes are sold. They do not make public that they have made an ingredient change. Yes, the boxes showed the right ingredient on the ingredients list, but they do not make a big deal. They don't put a new on the package. They don't run an ad campaign now with new natural flavors and no artificial preservatives. So they wait till 50 million boxes are sold, almost 2 months in market, and they launch their campaign, the world's biggest blind taste test. And on the day of the big reveal, they ran ads with headlines like, we would invite you to try it, but you already have. And the social hashtag didn't notice. And the campaign was wildly well received because people were already enjoying the new recipe. And so they were already more receptive to the idea that they were getting better things in their macaroni and cheese without sacrificing taste or quality. And for us, I think that was that moment where we looked at it and we said, wow, they actually had a real insight into human psychology that we could back up with some academic data.
Absolutely. And it's something other brands, especially people who work on a food brand, it's something that they can apply. So I think the key bit of research here is around an idea called expectation assimilation. It's essentially the idea that what people taste is not just a factor of the physical ingredients, it's also determined by what they expect to taste. So the idea being, if you think something is going to taste brilliant, it probably will. If you think something's going to taste awful, it probably will. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, whatever expectations we have. Now, that relates to craft because certainly in America, certainly in Britain, people assume healthy food is bad tasting, and that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, not speculation, there's a lovely study by Raghunathan, I think it's the Coombe School of Business, does this study back in 2006 amongst a group of Texans. And he sets up a massive buffet of Indian food. So there's naan breads, there's basmati rice, there's curries, there's a
making me hungry.
Yeah, this is a bad time to be doing it. I'm starting to salivate. And crucially, there is a mango lassi on offer.
Yeah.
Now, everyone is asked to try the food and then rate it. Most of the food items are a smokescreen. Raghunathan doesn't care about the ratings for the curries or the naan breads. All he cares about is how people rate the mango lassi. So this is an Indian yogurt drink. Now, for the lassi, when people try it, he sometimes says this is an Indian health drink. Other times he tells people it's an unhealthy Indian drink. Everyone has the same yogurt drink. The story, though, changes. So it's just the wrapper around that changes. And what Raghunathan finds is that if people think the product is healthy, they will rate that product 55% worse than the people who think it's unhealthy. People assume health equals bad tasting, and then that becomes their actual experience. They go out and look for confirming evidence. So the brilliance of Kraft mac and cheese was change the recipe, make it healthier, let people try it. They didn't notice the difference. And only afterwards you reveal it's super healthy. And that way you can keep on, as you said, comically reminding people they've already tried this stuff. They already like it. You can remove the sting from this improvement in the recipe's credentials.
We made it one of our first chapters because of the final thing you said. It was a great 1-2 punch. It was a great insight into human nature to not share the healthier ingredients up front for fear it could have consumer backlash. That's great. And that is why we chose it. But the successful creative that engaged people, hashtag didn't notice. We would have invited you to the blind taste test, but you're already in it. That wonderful creative execution is what brings it over the top. So it's not just the human insight. It's how you then creatively turn that into great brand building, great engagement with the customers that to us brought it to the top of the list as really one of the great examples.
Absolutely. Like knowing about a behavioral science principle is not the final thing. It is a great step. It tells you about a human insight which has the potential to make for brilliant marketing. But the behavioral insight alone isn't enough. You can imagine another situation where another company knows about Raghunathan's work and they say, okay, well, let's just announce that we've improved the recipe. It's now much healthier. And we're going to have to spend an extra £5 or £10 million counterbalancing that effect with more advertising, talking about appeal and tastiness. Now, that would have been probably a quite successful campaign and a reasonably good use of a human insight. But absolutely, the way that Kraft mac and cheese deal with this, it's the same insight, but by adding this dash of lateral thinking, this dollop of creativity, they get so much more out of it. And that's a great way of thinking about any of these experiments.
I've seen that at the ad agency I run, Method One. They've used behavioral science to spark that greater creativity, that greater overall effect of the campaign. And so, for our listeners at home or at agencies, this is one way to just bring this in and think about how academics can inspire lateral thinking, can inspire other ways of doing great creative work. But if you're on the brand team side, if you're at a brand, if you're in a small business, using these to inspire your creative partners is a great way to give them a sandbox to play in. So I think widely this can be used to spark the right next creative move for your branded market.
Yeah, it's definitely the best way of positioning behavioral science. If a behavioral science specialist goes into an agency or a company very arrogantly saying they've got all the answers, they're just going to put the marketing team and the creative teams back up and little will come of it. If they're a bit more humble, I think, and say, look, these are really powerful insights, but they require your expertise as marketers, your expertise as copywriters or art directors, then I think you're going to end up with far better results. You need to work hand in hand with the creatives and marketers.
I hadn't thought about it, but I think that's why we've gotten such a wide reception to the book, because while you and I, we had our, as good marketers, right, Richard, we had our target market, we had our secondary goals of who would like the book, we had our target narrow, catch wide strategy, but actually, lots of people find these insights really applicable, even if they're only connected to marketing, even if they're not in the career profession of being marketers, because they primarily reveal the insight into human nature and the opportunity that it gives you. What to do with it is a marketer's job. How to activate against it, as we're saying, is the creative work to be done.
Yeah, and it's why the examples are so nice, because you've got this lovely range of 17 brands who've put some amazing creative spins on some powerful long-term behavioral science principles.
Yeah. Well said. So, Kraft macaroni and cheese, one of my favorite. I'll turn it to you, my friend.
Okay.
Of all of the chapter babies that we had, what was one of your favorite stories from the book?
I think probably my favorite, ironically, was Dyson. And the irony will become apparent, because for many of the brands, it took an awful lot of research to understand what the brands have been doing, to understand what behavioral science they'd used. Whereas Dyson was a little bit different. I can remember opening James Dyson's autobiography. I think it's called Invention, My Life. And on the very first page, the very first paragraph, the very first sentence, it says, I went through 4 years and 5,127 prototypes before I came up with a bagless vacuum. And I can remember spotting that and thinking, oh, wow, this is amazing. This is a behavioral science masterclass in a sentence. He's packing in behavioral science biases that other people can use. Now, that might feel a bit random. It's just his autobiography. But actually, that theme of constantly reiterating the 5,127 prototypes, it runs through Dyson's work again and again and again. His biography, the website, the PR press releases, the very first ads, all of them double down on this number, 5,127. And to me, that is an amazing piece of behavioral science, because it draws on this idea of the illusion of effort. So, long-standing idea from behavioral science, and it's essentially the argument that the same product, like a vacuum, will be rated very differently if people believe lots of effort has gone into it. So if people think James Dyson knocked this vacuum out in 5 minutes, they might give it a go and rate it as being quite good. If they think he spent 4 years and 5,500 prototypes getting there, they will use that vacuum and they'll rate the experience much better. Now, the original experimentation was done by people like Andrea Morales and others. but often they did it in quite bizarre areas. So some of the experiments were done around poems or art pieces or estate agents. And when we read about those experiments, and we do include some of them in the book, don't get me wrong, but when we read about them, we felt that there was a bit of a gap between the existing academic literature and then the challenges marketers face. So this was one of the chapters where we ran our own experimentation. We went out, recruited 278 Americans, randomized them into two groups, and half the people saw a fake brand, this image of Black Sheep vodka, a beautifully designed bottle of vodka, and half of them just saw that image. Half of them were told the designer went through 143 iterations. And when those two groups were asked how much they liked the design, we saw a very clear difference. So, no story about effort. 17% of people liked or loved it. Story about the 143 designs. 23% of people liked or loved it. So you get this 35% uplift in appreciation for a piece of design if people know the story of effort that's gone into it. Now, remember, exactly the same design, but the impact it had varied according to whether people had heard about this effort. So I think that's the principle. And we do talk about others in the chapter, but that's the really exciting principle that can be applied far, far more broadly.
You know, Richard, this conversation is reminding me of an episode we just completed a few weeks ago, episode 98 with Tara Austin. And she's from Ogilvy Change. She talks about behavioral science bias stacking. Like, can you use multiple biases at the same time? And when you were going through the story of Dyson, he's making his illusion of effort so clear. But what struck me was he's also doing it consistently in his autobiography, in the first ad, in the press release, on the website. And for a long period of time, they still talk about the 5,127 prototypes many years after launch. Consistency is not necessarily a behavioral science bias, but they're stacking marketing best practices here. Do you think that when you're so consistent by showing the illusion of effort in all the touch points, that has a compounding effect?
I think arguably, I think there certainly is experimentation about the power of consistency. There's the Zionch work around the mere exposure effect. So what he showed was, if you got people to flick through an album and that album had faces in it, and people would go through to the end and then say how beautiful they thought the faces were, if the album had, say, a face repeated 3 times, people tended to think that was more beautiful than a face that had just been repeated once. What he showed was simple repetition breeds contentment rather than contempt. So he called this the mere exposure effect. So the longer you go out with an idea or an argument, the more likely it is to be received positively. I think that would be a fair extension of Zionch's work.
Which means that you can have a really great insight. Like, hey, if we told people 4 years, 5,127 prototypes, that will likely make a big impact. But if you use it consistently and you keep showing it, it will make it more relatable. It will make it more likable just by the fact that you're harping on this idea. So I think you can use this stacking in ways to make it more effective.
Yeah, there's 2 ways of looking at it. You can make the biases more effective through repetition and consistency, absolutely. And then I think the other part you can do is stack multiple biases on top of each other. So you can argue the Dyson line, 5,127 prototypes, is so effective. One, because it emphasizes effort, and that taps into this illusion of effort. But the other thing it does is use precision. It doesn't say 5,000 biases. It doesn't say nearly 6,000 biases. It says 5,127. And there's some lovely work by people like Schindler that show believability of a number of a claim is boosted, not by a huge degree, like all about 5% or so, but it's boosted if you use a precise number. So I think he's stacking precision and illusion of effort on top of each other, and he's consistent and repetitive, as you mentioned.
So if that's maybe the first 70%, maybe 50% of why you chose this one. The other part of what to me was so brilliant about the marketing team's decision of how they delivered this claim, they decided when they made the product to make the bin that collects the rubbish transparent. And I think that might have been the first time in any vacuum cleaner that they showed the garbage that was being picked up. And that clear, transparent bin, in the show notes, we'll put the original ad, is prominently featured. The design of uh, the vacuum cleaners against a stark black background, if I'm thinking of the right ad, and you could see how transparent the bin is. It's a critical component of the advertising and of the product design itself. And that is a way of showing the effort, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I always think, well, the black sheep vodka experiment we discussed is quite a big leap to say from that experiment it proves the power of the transparent bin. But there are other studies that do it very well. There's an amazing study from 2015 by Ryan Burwell and Kim. I think Burwell's at Harvard or Harvard Business School. And what they do is work with a cafeteria and they serve people the same dish, but some of the diners can see into the kitchen and some of the diners can't see into the kitchen. And even though they're rating the same food, everyone's got the same food in front of them, the people that can see into the kitchen, they'll rate it 7% better than those who can't see into the kitchen. So absolutely, the design of a situation, the making the work that's going on behind the scenes more salient, more visible, more obvious. I think that study from Kim is a very good proof point that the design changes Dyson did will also harness this effect.
To me, you and I have talked about literal applications, lateral applications, but we're often talking about that in creative campaigns. To me, to build into the product itself, the effort that's happening was a revolutionary idea. And would you consider that a lateral application of the effort, or would you just consider that like practically showing the effectiveness of the work? I mean, how would you describe what they're doing there?
I think that's a very good point. I would say it goes back to the point you were making right at the beginning of the podcast, which was these principles are not just for media planners or marketers or creative directors. They're also for anyone who's trying to influence behavior of others. Now, that could be a product designer, that could be a CEO, that could be an HR director. Each of them has their own challenges and their own kind of palette and tools they could use. The principles are the same. It's just those specialities have got different techniques for using them. So this is an example of a technique being used by a copywriter, and then that same technique of the illusion of effort being used by the product designer.
Yeah. And there's something about, we have a Dyson at home, but my whole childhood and my whole bachelorhood, I had a bag vacuum. And the least pleasant part of a bagged vacuum experience is undoing the hose and taking this dirt filled bag and putting it in the garbage where inevitably a puff of dust will come up. Versus to your face, versus the experience of a Dyson where you see all of the dirt and grime and dust captured, and the actual motion of pushing the dirt into the garbage is like ejecting it from the machine. It's a very satisfying motion. And to me, that's kind of the ingenious of the Dyson user experience, the human product interface. Every bit of it is built on this idea that you've accomplished something by doing the vacuuming. You could see it, and then even in the ejecting of the rubbish, you get this sense that you have you've completed the effort.
Well, I'd never thought about that. So not only a Dyson, I didn't quite know that like trough of the product's experience has been removed, and that's a super important thing to do. As marketers, we're always thinking about how do we make the great bits of our brands better. But actually, behavioral scientists would probably say, well, before you do that, what's the worst bit of the brand? What's the real shoddy bit of the experience? You want to be lessening that trough. I can never quite remember the academic. It's either Pratto or Feldman. And they did two different studies all on the kind of same area. But one of them was around this thing called the negativity bias. Essentially, negative information sticks with us. We remember it more. It's more powerful than positive information. And one of the studies was just to give people a list of adjectives. Some were positive character traits like generosity. Some were negative ones like meanness or rudeness. People read the list. The list is taken away. And then a few minutes or hours later, whatever it was, the audience are asked to try and remember as much as they can. And again, it's the negative stuff that sticks in their mind. You know, negative information has a longer half-life than positive information. So if you are trying to create a brilliant brand experience, removing a little bit of negativity will have a better impact on experience than removing the same volume, adding in the same volume of positivity.
Signpost, as you and I say, to an old episode from 11 Madison Park. Our friend Will Guidara. This is episode 56. Thank you, search feature of my browser.
Yeah.
Episode 56. This is what Will Guidara famously does in Unreasonable Hospitality, right? He goes and instead of looking at all the best Michelin-rated restaurants, at what they do well, he looks exactly as you're saying for what they don't do as well. And that's where he tries to make 11 Madison Park stand out. And that's really what he becomes really well known for.
Yeah. So he talks about that in his wonderful book, Unreasonable Hospitality. And then Rory Sutherland builds on some of those ideas Will Guidara talks about by coming up with this phrase called reverse benchmarking. Because he essentially says, look, we're so interested in copying the successes of other brands. What we should also do is find out where they're really weak and then double down ourselves in those areas. Because if every other Michelin star restaurant has got an amazing wine list, it will take gargantuan, titanic efforts to beat them. But you can create lots of positive energy and memory amongst your clientele if you have an amazing beer sommelier or a coffee sommelier. You know, the benchmark is lower, so you can succeed much more easily. So I think, yeah, those episodes would well be worth people referring back to.
Lovely. So we could go through so many other brands, but I'm watching the time here. I'm just going to read out for everybody a few of the other chapters because I think it would be interesting for folks to know some of the other brands we covered here. We start with Five Guys, and we talk about this brilliant insight that the founder, Jerry Morrell, had about the gold illusion effect, about how if you focus on one thing, it's going to be much more powerful than talking about multiple benefits. We also cover Starbucks, pumpkin spice latte around scarcity and nostalgia, Snickers around humor and using trigger moments, Apple. You know what, Richard? Maybe we said we'd come back to Apple. Let's just talk about Apple for a minute. I'll just give people very quick highlights. Amazon Prime, Aperol, Haagen-Dazs, Red Bull, Guinness, which was our first episode ever. Good to note for everybody. We made sure that if we did cover it in a podcast, our book went deeper and more meaningful into the topics that we wanted to. So you get lots of good new information. Liquid Death, Dyson we talked about, Facebook, Klarna, the Got Milk campaign, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and Pringles. A wide variety. And we asked ourselves, was there one thing that if we could edit the book now that it's live, is there one thing that we would add or do differently now that it's published?
Yeah, and I'm in two minds about this, but there could be an argument that we should have included a B2B brand, because often people will say, oh, these behavioural science principles, they'll work on small purchases like cans of Coke and bags of crisps, but they're not going to affect multi-million pound decisions. Now, that is a widespread belief, but just because it's widespread doesn't mean it's true. It's a myth. All the evidence points in the other way. All the evidence suggests that most of these principles that have been proving on citizens, on shoppers, they're just as powerful on professionals. So I think there could have been an argument for having a behavioural science dedicated chapter on a B2B brand. However, I think the reason we didn't do it, and the complexity, is when we go into pumpkin spice latte for a chapter, or when we talk about Facebook, immediately everyone knows what we're talking about. You don't have to spend pages after pages explaining the category, the setup, the background. You can go straight into the experiments and the implications. And that's the difficulty. I think it's a writing difficulty with behavioral science brands. It's hard to make it both readable to everyone and pithy and practical if you use a B2B example.
And we're nothing if not pithy. And we're nothing if not pithy in our writing. Yes, please going.
Maybe one of those chapters, in hindsight, could have tried to grapple with that, because I think it's a real damaging myth, this belief that behavioral science doesn't apply to B2B.
We're going to talk at the end of the episode. You and I then, after writing the book, decided to do one more big new project, which we're announcing on this podcast. We made a masterclass that takes the ideas of the book and puts them into short form, 7-minute instructional videos that folks can listen. I'll talk more about that at the end of the episode. But the reason I raise it now is because we actually address some B2B brands in our masterclass. I believe we covered Zoom and the buyers and how Zoom started really in the B2B space long before it was a B2C brand. Yeah,
absolutely. So I think that's probably an example of a brand that you can describe pithily, because it's transitioned from B2B beyond, or so many people use it across industry. So that now, if we'd thought about it earlier, we could have done a chapter on that and the power of social proof and other such biases and ease.
But for those that are interested, the masterclass has some of that, and of course we have previous podcast episodes where we talk more high level about it. So that's really interesting, Richard. As we come to a close, let's give everybody a recap of what we've covered in today's episode.
We've covered 3 big areas, I think, in this episode. The first one is the craft story and their use of this idea of expectation assimilation. It's essentially the argument that people taste what they expect to taste. They experience what they expect to experience. Your job as a marketer is to set up the most positive possible expectation of your brand, and that will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, Kraft did that in a very specific way. They avoided the over early referencing of their health properties. We know that was the right thing to do because of the Ragunathon experiment. The second thing we talked about was Dyson and the illusion of effort. So the illusion of effort is the argument that the same product, the exact same product, will be more appreciated if people are aware of the effort that's gone into their creation. And we talked about some of our own experimentation in that field. We talked about our experience with Black Sheep vodka, showing the design of a vodka bottle could be more appreciated if people knew the number of iterations it had been through. And then finally, we talked about B2B. It's a massive misnomer. People cling within marketing to this idea that B2B buyers are completely different from B2C buyers. But when it comes to the behavioral science principles, there's experiment after experiment after experiment showing professionals are affected by exactly the same biases. So make sure you're using these principles, yes, influencing your consumers, but you can also do it on your colleagues or professional buyers.
Thank you for that wrap up. So for everyone listening, if you're watching, the book is Hacking the Human Mind. It's available on Amazon. It's available at all your local booksellers. And if you want to get more details about the book, hackingthehumanmind.com is the website for you to learn much more about the book, get a download of a free chapter if that would be helpful to you, and of course sign up for our newsletter and stay up to date on all that we're doing. Richard, in the middle of the episode, we teased our next big project. And I wanted to talk about it a little bit here because when we finished the book, we really felt that there was so much knowledge packed in, but 230 odd pages is not everyone's cup of tea. As we know from the podcast, lots of people like to listen, they like to watch, they're not learners through written word alone. So if you want to go deeper into the written word, the book is your best bet. If you learn through listening and through watching, we've put together our first joint masterclass. We're calling it Hacking the Human Mind, the Masterclass. And if you go to www.hackingthehumanmind.com, you can click and see the tab for the masterclass. 42 lectures, 32 brand case studies, over 35 biases. And we present many that are in the book, but with 32 brand case studies, many more that were not in the book. All in short form lessons, lots of visuals on the screen, lots of animated on-screen visuals. There's a promo video if you want to see what it's like. There's even a preview episode on the website. So for those that would really like to go deeper and go engage with the content in different ways and get a lot more brands with a lot more studies inspired by the book, Hacking the Human Mind, the masterclass is for you. Any other additional information you think would be helpful for people to hear?
Oh, I think that was perfect. Yeah, go there now. That'd be the thing.
Go there now, and we hope
pull
that
over
it's
to the
of
side of
you.
the road. Yeah, stop,
No accidents. No accidents, but safely navigate your way there on the World Wide Web. And with that, we want to say thank you to everyone for all your support of our first 100 episodes. Thanks for your support. If you've already gotten the book, and if this is the first time you're learning about it and it's helpful to you, we'd love for you to pick up a copy of the book. Please leave a review on Amazon or on your bookseller. It helps others learn about what you got from the book. And as we said, if the masterclass could be something of service to you, hackingthehumanmind.com. And until next time, I'm Michael Aaron Flicker.
And I'm Richard Shotton.
Thanks for listening.
Behavioral Science for Brands is brought to you by Method One. Recognized as one of the fastest growing companies in America for the third year in a row, featured on Inc.'s 5,000 list. Method One is a proudly independent creative and media agency grounded in behavioral science. They exist to make brands irresistible, helping people discover products, services, and experiences that bring moments of joy to their lives. As behavior change experts, Method One creates emotional connections that drive true brand value for their clients, focusing primarily with indulgence brands in the CPG space. Find out more at methodone.com.